Good morning and welcome to the 34th meeting in 2012 of the Health and Sport Committee. And as usual at this point, can I remind all of those present to switch off mobile phones and Blackberries as they can often interfere with the sound system. The first item on our agenda today is consideration on whether to take item 3 in private. Item 3 is to consider once again the approach to the work on access to new medicines. Can I have the committee's agreement that we take item 3 in private? Thank you. We now move to item 2 on the agenda, which is a one-off evidence session on health and safety executive. And I am pleased to welcome to the committee Pam Waldron, Head of Operations, welcome, and Dr David Snowball, Director, Scotland and Northern Ireland Health and Safety Executive. And I invite an opening statement from, is it Pam?
May I just correct you, Convener?
Yes,
it's Scotland and Northern England, I'm afraid.
Is it?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, so it is. It is Northern England.
I would like it to be Scotland and Northern Ireland.
It is Northern England.
Thank you very much. I'll make a few opening remarks, Convener. And first of all, thank you for the invitation to attend. A few points, really, which I hope will contextualise the conversation and the questions that come later. First of all, the Health and Safety Executive is the GB independent regulator for work-related health and safety, and we've approximately 270 staff in Scotland based in 4 offices in Edinburgh, Glasgow, Aberdeen and Inverness. We work directly with Scottish stakeholders, and many of those stakeholders are independent or semi-independent of their counterparts south of the border, and in some cases they're unique to Scotland. On topics impacting on promoting healthy lifestyles, for example. And we respond both to MSPs and Scottish MPs on Scottish matters relevant to health and safety. Health and safety law is the same across the whole of Great Britain, but in Scotland we have a different situation where health and safety executive inspectors report matters they've investigated directly to the Crown Office and the Procurator Fiscal, and it's the Procurator Fiscal who decides whether or not criminal proceedings should be brought in the public interest. And in 2009, the Lord Advocate established a specialist health and safety division within Crown Office. In comparison with other European countries, Scotland has a low rate of fatal injuries at work, and the geographical variations that we see in Scotland compared with other parts of Great Britain, we think are driven by occupation rather than by geography. Really, our strategic aims as a regulator are to ensure several key things. First of all, that the regulator is just part of the picture, that those who create the risks must take their role and do the right thing in making sure they manage those risks. And they must act proportionately and focus on the things that really make a difference. And finally, we aren't the sole regulators of health and safety in Scotland. The 32 Scottish local authorities, their activities cover approximately 45% of the workforce. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Richard Simpson?
Yes. We're living in a time of austerity, and I assume that your budgets, along with everybody else's, have been cut. And that there's also been the Lofsted review inviting you to make a number of changes, one of which I note is to reduce the number, I think it's number of regulations by 50% or something, which seems to me to be a difficult circle to square, to reduce the number of regulations at the same time as maintaining patient safety. So my question really is, how are you surviving under the austerity regime? How much of a cut have you had to take? Is it frontline inspectors? Where are the cuts being made? And how are you progressing with Professor Lofsted's report, particularly in respect of the cuts?
The headline figure that the HSE are required to make a cut is 35%. We are deliberately attempting to protect the front line. So in answer to your first question, we are not seeking to make cuts which will deliberately cut into the muscle at the front line, if you like. The Lofsted review, which reported about a year ago, and Professor Lofsted is about to do a review of how far he thinks we've got next month, I believe. I think there's an important point to make there about regulation in general. One of the things that would strike even a casual observer of the health and safety regulatory landscape is the age of some of the regulations that still sit on the statute books. The key piece of regulation remains the 1974 Health and Safety at Work Act, and from that much good has flowed over the years. In certain specific sectors, for example, the mines sector, the explosives sector, there has been a slow, steady accumulation of regulations over the years. And in the explosives sector, for instance, one of the key pieces of regulations dates back to 1875, which is a mark of its perpetuity, really, a mark of its integrity at the time. But I think one of the important points to make about the Lofstad review in relation to the reduction of the number of regulations that remain on the statute books is, as part of our attempt to make regulation fit for the modern world, much of that old, and I use that in not in a derogatory sense, older regulation isn't always doing the business as well as it might. And that goal-setting ethos which permeates the Health and Safety at Work Act and which leads forward into much modern regulation, Lofstad has given us a very valuable opportunity to try and reshape that regulatory landscape. And in some cases it will, yes, mean that old pieces of legislation that are no longer fit for purpose will be wiped from the statute books, but it will not, and it cannot, because Section 1 of the Health and Safety at Work Act doesn't allow us to do it, it cannot lead to a reduction in the protection that is offered to people at work.
Thank you very much. And you're really saying that a 35% cut, you can make that without affecting frontline staff or reducing your work? Because, I mean, that is an extra... I mean, that would indicate to me an organisation that was so replete with a surrounding of fat. If you can really sustain 35% and not have any effect upon frontline, I find that... extraordinary.
Yes.
I mean, if there have been cuts of 10%, local authorities in England are taking more than that, 15%. Scotland the same, but that's difficult enough. But 35% seems to me to be. There must be some muscle, bone, and other suitable strength organs that are being damaged by this.
We're heading down an abattoir analogy here, aren't we? Really, you're absolutely right. Some of that gap will be made up by the fee for intervention arrangements, which have come into place. HSE is now able to recover costs for some of the work that we do where we find material breaches in workplaces. Some of the other things, I think, though, to bear in mind are that GB-wide, HSE has had to make, as you would expect, some quite hard decisions about where we have offices, the extent to which we are locked into lease arrangements in buildings which we can no longer afford. We've had to make some quite tough decisions about where we close offices. So it isn't just a case that we would want to reduce headcount, although there was an voluntary early release scheme that gave us some early advantages in that regard. But no, I wouldn't want to give the committee any sense of complacency that the extent to which a 35% cut may ultimately start cutting into that very important frontline muscle isn't an issue that we have to take very, very seriously indeed. The Treasury... on our fee for intervention arrangements, we are allowed to cost recover, but the amount we're allowed to cost recover is capped over the next 3 years, and that will make a difference. And it may actually mean that over that period of time, in the next 3 years, that 35% doesn't end up being 35%. But I wouldn't, as you rightly pointed out and gently rebuked me, it would be silly to defend that 35% was something that any organisation could willingly absorb, because we haven't got a lot of fat around, we haven't got a lot of fat to cut. And to pretend otherwise would be wrong. Thank
you for that. I mean, it's concerning. We've been through the stockline issue in Scotland, which was I think, was a very difficult issue for us here, and has led to debate about corporate manslaughter and the rest. And I know you've had to now inspect all underground gas pipes, which is a major undertaking. It was not thought to be an area of concern previously, but I am concerned if the cuts are sufficient, would be sufficient to say, well, if there's another issue of the stockline type, which you've regarded as safe up till now, but you might think, well, maybe we should look at it, but you can't because you haven't the resources. But you're saying that is not going to happen. I think it would. I'd answer it in a different way. We are driven as often like any public organisation by events. And occasionally you have to reorganise your priorities in order to respond to events as you see them. So I wouldn't use an absolute term like low risk, poor performance or anything like that. I would use a phrase like lower risk, higher risk, poorer performance. And one of the things that the ICL, the fallout from ICL, as you rightly say, led to a very comprehensive assessment of the integrity of underground LPG pipes. But actually the way we did that, I think, was quite an efficient way. We didn't visit everybody who had an underground pipe. We very carefully triaged the sites that we needed to visit. And when we went to them, actually, we got a very high return on what I would call enforcement yield,
when we actually eyeballed the people that had LPG tanks and LPG underground pipes, and when we identified and our inspectors identified failures in control, we were probably serving enforcement notice in between a quarter and a third of the situations that we encountered. Yes. I looked at Pam just to confirm that. But that, to me, suggests that, A, we got our priorities right in terms of identifying where we thought the problems might be most acute. And then when we showed up and did the right thing, we followed it through properly and we made sure that we got a proper result at the end of it.
Bob Doris.
Thanks, Convener. Just like to dig down a little bit further on what a 35% cut to the budget means. So could you perhaps maybe, first of all, say over how many years is the 35% cut?
The period of the public spending round, is it 2012 to 4 years? Yeah.
So 2012 for 4 years?
Yeah.
Okay. And what's that in cash terms on a UK-wide basis?
Could I come back to you with the detail on that, please? The reason I don't want to make or provide figures that turn out to be incorrect, but can I give you a detailed breakdown of that in a note afterwards, if that would be helpful?
Yes, I'm going to continue to ask other linked questions, I have to say. You may have to come back with more information on that. Of course,
yes.
Because I'm keen to know what the cash budget is before the 35% cut, what it will be over the 4-year period, and then not just what that is at a UK level, but what that is for Scottish spend. So can you tell us what proportion?
We will be able to tell you that, yes, of course.
Do you have the information just in percentage terms of what the Scottish spend is vis-a-vis the global
Not in
UK
front of me,
budget?
I don't know.
Okay. Well, that would be helpful to the committee as well. Can you tell me how many inspectors you have on the ground within the UK and also within Scotland, so we can get, because the number becomes meaningless unless we know how much Scotland has vis-a-vis the UK.
Right. We have 173 inspectors of health and safety in Scotland, of whom 162 are frontline, and that is 13% of the GB-wide frontline inspector total.
So fairly well represented.
Yes.
In relation to that, and that's why that becomes meaningful, because we need to know what it is in percentage terms to give it some basis. How is that arrived at? Is Scotland seen as a more dangerous place? Is it just because of the geography of Scotland? Why do we have a higher pro rata number of inspectors?
Two things, really. I mean, my area covers northeast, northwest England and Yorkshire and Humberside, and some of the statistics in those regions are every bit as worrying to us in terms of fatals and major injuries as they are in Scotland. The analysis that we've done on the reasons why the fatal injury rate in Scotland is as it is mainly to do with occupation, and by that I mean, for example, if we take the fatal statistics, 20 employees lost their lives at work in Scotland in 2011-12. Every year, if we break those figures down and we say in what sectors did those injuries occur, the same sorts of sectors appear over and over again. For example, agriculture, construction, waste and recycling. Now, that is a reflection of the workforce composition in the particular region. I think that if 40% of our fatals in any one year involve agriculture in Scotland, for example, the Scottish workforce represented in aggregate is only 4%. And that's mirrored across the whole of the UK. And over the whole of the UK, our statisticians and we've obviously asked exactly that question, to what extent is geography or occupation a precursor for a fatal accident rate that is worrying or not worrying? And over the whole of the UK, that picture tends to repeat itself. It's the character of the occupation rather than the geography in which it's carried out that is the main determinant of those fatal injury outcomes.
Looking at the industrial landscape to determine what the risks are in terms, and that feeds into what the level of inspectors you would have in any particular part.
It feeds into how we make our inspection-based priorities, and one of the things that you do have in common with many other, let's say the polite way, but formerly heavily industrialised areas would be the legacy of things like asbestosis, mesothelioma and asbestos-related disease.
I assume you have a workforce plan to go from 162 inspectors. Is that going to be standstill? Is that going to be cut?
We are aiming to protect as far as we possibly can the front line, yes.
Now, you say as far as possible. Does that mean your 4-year projection means we will retain 162?
It depends if we can recruit. We will obviously lose people because they will retire. It depends if we can recruit new staff.
Yeah, but that's the same in any industry, any sector. I assume you're doing that 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So you're saying there is no cash pressure in terms of retaining those 162 despite, I don't want to put words into your mouth, the 35% cut over 4 years, you're confident you will retain 162 inspectors in Scotland, assuming you can recruit them?
Yes.
Given the economic climate, I think you'll have no problem in recruiting them. Is that projected on taking how much in terms of recovering costs, given these new cap powers you have for the next 3 years?
We have been told that in terms of the cost recovery money that we are allowed to keep, I've got the figures here, I'll just find them. Uh, 2011-12 we can keep £10 million, 2012-13 £17 million, 2013-14 £23 million.
Say you can, I'll finish off shortly. You say you can keep those, but I assume that is monies raised from the sector, from a sector is in breach, that you get those monies from?
If inspectors encounter a duty holder who is in material breach of the legislation, and we then decide that there is a basis on which we can recover costs for HSE intervention, which might be investigation or inspection, we're allowed to recover our costs at the rate of £124 an hour.
Has that always been the case? This is not a new thing, it's just about you can actually retain these now?
The cost recovery is new from the 1st of October this year. It's called fee for intervention, and it came in the 1st of October this year. So it's new territory for us, yes. So although we have been cost recovering in the offshore and the onshore major hazard sectors for many years under the safety case and permissioning regimes.
Okay, that's interesting to know. So it's hypothesised because we've not really done that yet. Finally, I should just check around the figures, and I may come back in later with some more questions that I would wish my colleagues get the chance to come in. The 10 million, the 17 million, the 23 million, I assume that those are UK-wide figures?
Yes.
And would you be able to provide the committee maybe at a later date, given the fact that Scotland has a higher prevalence of risk in terms of industrial injuries and accidents, fatalities because of the industrial landscape? Can we assume that companies in Scotland may be more likely to be fined in relation to that vis-à-vis the rest of the UK?
I would characterise it slightly differently. If our inspection priorities are based on going to high-risk sectors where we expect to find poorer performers, and where we are also investigating incidents that occur more frequently in Scotland, that would mean inspectors might be crossing the threshold of premises in Scotland on a rate which bears interest in comparison with their counterparts in England and Wales. I would hesitate to say that we expect to recover more pro rata in Scotland, because I think that remains to be seen how that all pans out. But what I would say is that the important thing is that we are prioritising our proactive, i.e. our reactive and our proactive work exactly the same way across the whole of the UK. And that pattern then would of how we intervene and the sorts of premises with which we intervene would not be a million miles away in Scotland from what it was in the rest of the UK.
More information to the committee would be really helpful on that, and I may come back in later, Convener, but I just want to try and tease out what the 35% cut would actually mean.
Thank you. Gil Patterson, followed by Drew Smith.
Thanks very much. Mr Snowball, you said that you would provide some figures. Could you, in relation to the figures you're providing, tell us what the total amount of staff numbers are in the UK, or in particular south of the border, so we get a comparison?
Yes. Because
you give us some frontline and staff.
Yes, we will do that.
Would be helpful. And the other thing is, I wondered if within that you said that the cover is 13% in Scotland. Does that the fact that these figures are relatively higher in Scotland, is that because of the oil industry? Does a disproportionate amount of people on the ground are they working in the oil industry rather than, since it's in head of population also, I would imagine, does that skew the figures in some way?
A significant proportion of all of our offshore inspectors are, as you rightly point out, based in Aberdeen. So we'll provide a breakdown of those figures for you. We'll tell you what the onshore and offshore major hazards work is compared to the non-offshore and offshore major hazards work.
It wasn't my main, in fact I wasn't going to bring in that, but just to give us a fuller picture so we can understand where we're at. I was going to ask you some questions in relation to asbestos-related disease, mesothelioma. It took me years to get that word out, in particular. And I'm involved, I may say, with people in my own constituency who campaign on asbestos-related issues. And one of their major concerns at the present time is that they're finding greater numbers of teachers, for instance, coming forward with asbestos-related diseases. And my question to you is, I know that you partner very well in Scotland with the local authorities, and I wondered if you could answer at the same time, do you do this, is it the same partnership do you have? Is it the same model that you have where you partner very closely with local authorities in the front line in this service, or
yes.
is it a different model in England?
Yes.
But my main thrust, the main thrust of my question to you is that one of the issues being raised at the present time is compiling a register of properties under local authority control where asbestos is present. Some authorities, like in Highlands, they've got a really good register, but in other areas it's very, very sparse. And I wondered what your views were on that, if that would be a good thing for your organisation.
Well, I think it's a valid and a good question. One of the things that I think we have to be clear about on asbestos is where the duty to control asbestos actually lies. And we've got a very, very precise set of regulations, and the title gives it away. It's called the Duty to Manage Regulations. And when you talk about the sheer scale on which asbestos used to be used, I mean, we reckon there are about 500,000 commercial properties in the UK and an unknown number of domestic premises where there may be asbestos. And contrary to popular belief, our advice is often don't disturb it if it's not damaged. But you have to know it's asbestos. You can't wander in and start chipping away at it and then discover to your surprise it's asbestos. And I think in the commercial sector, the duty to manage has been around for some time, and it's absolutely, it's inked into the regulations that if you've got asbestos, you've got to be able to say where it is, what condition it's in, and whether it needs removing. And actually, that's the critical point at which building owners, commercial landlords, local authorities, and so on have to be able to put their hands on something tangible and say, and that's my register. And on the basis of that register, that's the extent to which we need to leave untouched. That's the extent to which we need to remove. Because one of the things that we've noticed, and Pam might want to add to this, is that there's often, and understandable given the prominence of asbestos-related stories in the press, there's often an enthusiasm to start removing asbestos when it doesn't need to be removed. As I said, our core message to people would be, if it's in good condition and it looks okay, leave it where it is. But Pam, do you want to add something about that?
Yes, I think that is the point, that people need to know whether there's asbestos in the building or not. And if they've had no surveys done, they have to assume that asbestos may be present. Left undisturbed, there's no risk. If there is any work that's carried on, particularly in the kind of plumbing trades, telecommunications, that kind of work that tends to go into ceiling voids and ducts and the like, that's when any asbestos can be disturbed. So it's very much about knowing whether there is asbestos in the building, which is where the asbestos register comes in, and making sure then that they communicate with any tradespeople who are then going to be working in the building. And it's that communication issue which is key. We do advocate that tradespeople have asbestos awareness training, and the evidence is that, anecdotal evidence is that tradesmen who know the likelihood of the presence of asbestos are much more cautious and ask the right questions. So we're coming at it from both sides, if you like. The owner or occupier of the building knowing where the asbestos is, the tradespeople now being much more aware of the potential for asbestos and asking the right questions, and that really is the way forward.
Are you aware if local authorities are obliged to compile? I know that when we entered into our office that we had to prove the non-existence of asbestos. Is that measure in place for existing properties if you're a tenant, like in a school? Or is it only when there's a change takes place? Have you an idea?
Every occupier owner of any building which is used in that way has a legal duty under the regulations that David's spoken about, duty to manage. I mean, that was quite a significant step when that legislation came in. The asbestos legislation up until then had really been about controlling its removal and very much about asbestos in manufacture. And so this is really a very key set of regulations to deal with that issue. about that because there is so much asbestos still in buildings, and it is a very good product and safe if undisturbed or removed in a very controlled manner.
Thanks very much. That's interesting. So you're saying that this register should actually be in place, which I find that's quite good news that you bring to me. It's maybe an easier task than I first thought. And in relation to my other side question, do you operate in the same manner in Scotland? Is it the same model in England where you partner very closely with councils?
I think we have relationships with councils in two ways. We have relationships with local authorities as fellow regulators. As I said at the outset, we enforce the Health and Safety at Work Act in different sorts of premises. So we have relations as regulators, and we have relationships with them as duty holders. And those relationships might be a combination of two things. It might be there are ways in which we can reach certain groups of duty holders much more efficiently through local authorities. And a good example would be waste and recycling. For example, if local authorities have to set out contracts with waste and recycling companies, and we've decided on the basis of statistics that waste and recycling is a worrying area for us in terms of accidents and ill health, the sensible way to do that is not to visit all the waste and recycling companies. The sensible way is to go through the contracts that they're set through local authorities and try and influence them through the supply chain. And that's a much more intelligent and informative way of getting to more people quicker. It still leaves people outside that supply chain, but it reduces that population of people outside the supply chain. And I mean, I think, in the absence of Pam disagreeing, we would have relationships with anybody if it was going to be productive, to be perfectly honest. And the basis on which we seek to improve health and safety standards in Scotland and the rest of Great Britain is through working where we can in partnership to achieve mutually beneficial ends. And I think it would be daft not to.
Where I was leading to was and I know you can't comment in detail, but I was just wondering about the authority and who would take the front line role if you consider the incident that had happened with water cooling towers, and who would it be that would, in Scottish terms, it looked as if it was very much a partnership, but the councils the local authorities seemed to act very, very quickly and swiftly. I think we're very pleased with that, and I wonder if that. Who would have the authority in England? Is it the exact same? That's really the point I was making.
It is. It's the exact same and the enforcing authority. There's a set of regulations called the Enforcing Authority Regulations, which sets out whether health and safety enforcement rests with HSE or with the local authority. When it comes to public health matters, of course, the local authorities have a lead. So the evidence that we gave in the summer when Colin Sibbald from Edinburgh Environmental Health Department was here. I think that gave you a flavour for the way that we work then as a multi-agency team with Health Protection Scotland and NHS Lothian. So we visited different premises according to the enforcing authority allocation, whether it's local authority enforced for health and safety legislation or HSE. But in terms of public health, the local authority had the lead, and we work very much together. Unless we communicate well, that's not going to work. So working very much as a team, and I think it did work quite well.
Well, the reason for my questioning, hoping that we could even improve it more, but if it's the same system, because like you, I think it did on the surface look as if it was very swift. And very effective. So,
I mean, all members of the team got together on the Sunday, if you recall, and we were carrying out inspections with our local authority colleagues the following day.
Thanks very much for that. Thank you.
We understand there's a criminal investigation, but just in general terms, what sort of post-analysis has taken place about that incident, and what areas do you believe have you identified areas for improvement in relationships there, or are we broadly content or very content about that incident, how it was managed? Is there any lessons to be learned that you have discovered and prepared to discuss with us today?
I think there are two things, Convener. First of all, in relation to the investigation, I mean, that's still ongoing. As you know, we're working with Lothian and Borders Police and Crown Office Procurator Fiscal Service on that. So if we set that aside and look at the outbreak team and how that worked, you recall that there was an interim report published. There is a final report due to be published this month, I believe. We have contributed to that, we have certainly discussed with you some of the lessons that were learnt about communication, if you recall, of residents in the area, and also how we work together as a team. You will find that we're reflecting on a number of issues in that report, which will come out. Don't have a date for this month, but I am expecting it to be out this month. I think we will always review how an outbreak team operates, and there are always things that we can learn from that.
Look forward to that report. Just following on Gil Patterson's, there's a couple of questions that just spring to mind in terms of the register of properties that may have asbestos in their construction, and the duty to manage regulations. And a third aspect that you mentioned, that once you compile the register, everybody wants the asbestos out of there. So there's a sensitive issue politically, and communication and dealing with a community once you identify that. Do you think that's a barrier to compiling an extensive register? And is that left up to local authorities to compile that register, knowing all of these pressures are on them? If I identify a school with asbestos in it, I've got a boycott of the school, or are we confident, if we believe that the register should be compiled, that that's making progress? How do we monitor that, and have we identified areas that I have suggested that significant communications problems or political problems that may arise of identifying asbestos? Are you satisfied that work is progressing?
I think the first thing would be that in the absence of a register, it would look a lot more worrisome. That would be the first point. The second point, I think, really is about the delights of risk communication. And one of the things that we find as a regulator of what we believe to be occupational safety and health is that we see a really broad range of stories. Let's use press stories on health and safety. At one extreme, we've got the crazy health and safety stories. And if you visit our website, you will see we've now started the 12 Myths of Christmas, which are gifted to us on an annual basis by the press. And the first two, yesterday and today, was that people in workplaces aren't allowed to put up Christmas decorations for health and safety. And today's is, if you put up Christmas decorations, you must have all your lights PAT tested. Now, those myths come around every year, and they sit on that very annoying for us, but actually it's become a fact of life, I'm afraid, end of the risk spectrum where risk communication is trivialised. And it undermines and it makes our lives much more difficult, and those are the local authorities and anybody involved in health and safety in a professional capacity at the other end of the extreme, which is health and safety ought to be properly managed in businesses. If you don't manage it, people have horrible consequences. They should be held to account for that, and that's why the law exists, and that's why we're trying to improve the basis on which the law is written and implemented, and so on and so forth. There's a great big gap in the middle, which is often empty. And as you rightly imply, convener, if you go to a school and you have a worried PTA, for example, who say, we understand there's a register which demonstrates this school has got asbestos in it, what are you going to do? It's a very brave person that stands up and says, we're going to leave it there because it's not a problem. I think there's a slightly more subtle communication required there, which is on the basis of expert advice from whoever, asbestos, if left undisturbed, will not release fibres. The trouble is the conversation doesn't always get to the point where that conversation takes place. So if your question is communication constantly a problem on something as as emotive as asbestos, the answer is yes. But I would much rather try and have the conversation than pretend it wasn't worth having in the first place.
It was a poor communication on my part, but I'm looking at the local authority's duty to manage as a public authority, as an employer, and I'm looking at their inspection role. Right. Who inspects the local authority to ensure?
We do.
Right.
Yes.
So you're confident that none of these difficult communications issues are holding back progress on the register of properties that may or do indeed have asbestos in their construction. So You've got no concerns there.
We enforce local authority because obviously they can't enforce themselves. So local authority schools and also independent schools come to HSE for enforcement. We have had a number of exercises over recent years looking at asbestos in schools, and the way we've dealt with that, as David's talking before, rather than go and visit individual schools, we have actually talk to the local authorities about the way they're managing their school estate, what they have by way of information about the presence of asbestos and how they're dealing with it. So we have had interventions in relation to asbestos in schools over a number of years, not just in the public schools, but also in the private schools. So we are reasonably confident, sir, that we have actually had the right conversations with all the local authorities and that they do understand they need to have registers for their premises and they need to have a mechanism for ensuring that if any work is done, that information is communicated to HEVA's.
Local authorities across Scotland, they're all making equal progress and good progress in registering buildings and public properties and properties in their area that may have asbestos in them. You're completely content that everybody's making good progress, equal progress, nobody's lagging behind.
That's a tall order, sir. I wouldn't want to say that everybody is equally as good as everybody else, but this has been in for some years. This isn't a new requirement. So, we've had a couple of iterations of this information. What I would be confident is that everybody knows the duty and everybody knows the requirement. So from that point of view, I would say that we have a good level of awareness in the local authorities. What
information do you have that could be shared with us then about the progress that has been made across the country?
What would you like, Convener? What would be the most useful way?
I would have thought that given that there's duty to manage, registers in place, that you would be able to get access to that internal information, and it wouldn't even necessarily, I would have thought, need an inspection. That's right. You could see that and view that online, and all I was looking for was some reassurance that when you reviewed the information that's available to all local authorities, there's no red flags. If you're telling me that's fine, I'll accept your word on it.
Yeah. Yes, that is what we've done. I mean, that started probably 4 years. Well, I'm just trying to remember when the regulations came out, but this started some years ago, and we've had another iteration. So we did exactly that. We asked them for the information about all of their properties, and we have had a reassurance. Where we felt that there was perhaps less reassurance than we would like, then we've obviously spent more time and done some sample inspections. Yes. So that's the way we've dealt with it.
There was a particular design of school as well, which led to some particular problems. Class buildings. I can't remember what it stands for. But we did specific targeted follow-up visits to those properties as well, those schools as well. The other thing, really, to go back to something I said at the beginning, Convener, if I could just reiterate it, really, is that one of the if you like, the foundations on which the regulatory landscape is based is that the duty holder has got to have a proper profiling of their own risks. Interestingly, I suspect if you went, the interesting question for me would be if you went to local authorities and you said, okay, you're all doing a broad variety of similar things. What's the order of priority in which you classify specific risks, such as waste and recycling, such as asbestos, such as procurement of services, that sort of thing? That is a slightly more academic exercise. That's the kind of exercise which might reveal some of that insight that you're seeking.
Drew Smith, followed by Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Convener. Can I apologise for being late and also draw members' attention to my register of interest as a past member of the General Council of the Scottish TUC. In an earlier answer to Bob Doris, I think it was quite clear that you thought the primary risk factor in terms of accidents in Scotland was character of trade that people are involved in. Do you accept there's also a link with economic deprivation, and we see higher levels of accidents in areas that suffer from economic deprivation?
We don't. I'm afraid we haven't got that research base on which to build. I think one of the things that, if you looked across the country as a whole, you would say that many of the legacy health issues are a direct consequence of the industrial past. And I can see some very obvious comparisons, as I said earlier, between the situation in Scotland and the north of England, which would not be mirrored further south. But further than that, I wouldn't like to speculate on the extent to which social deprivation was actually now determining the pattern of workplace ill health and fatal injuries.
Okay. Bob Doris also kind of touched on well, we discussed with you the particular issues we have in Scotland, and you indicated, we've got a decent level of inspectors vis-a-vis the rest of the UK. We know that we have a higher level of accidents. I presume that means that we have a higher level of prosecutions?
We have, I think what you're asking me is, can I give you the figures for Scotland compared to the rest of the UK? I haven't got those in front of me, but we can provide those if you'd like. I think we have a very high success rate through working with the Crown Office. As I said right at the beginning, the situation in Scotland differs from the rest of the, Great Britain, where an inspector can't, as they can in England and Wales, through their line management chain, have a prosecution approved and see it right through the system. I think the Crown Office, Procurator Fiscal Service actually provide a very important and welcome for us level of oversight and challenge that means that the cases that we do get to court, we have a 94% conviction rate of the cases that get into court. And that's a pretty impressive conviction rate in my view.
Because I think there was some evidence to the Scottish Affairs Committee that might have suggested that we now have this specialist service within the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service. There's also danger that slows things down, rather than targets the resource in the way that we would hope. But you said you didn't have the figures. So on prosecutions in Scotland, do you don't have the figures in terms of the exact detail, or you know that they're slightly higher, they're slightly lower, there's a wide divergence?
What I'd say is in the summary stats brief for Scotland in 2011-12, inspectors in Scotland issued 852 notices. That's improvement and prohibition notice, and we prosecuted 33 cases, 31 of which led to a conviction. So those are the raw data. One of the other things about the Crown Office is, and it's a valid criticism, and it's a criticism that we are extremely attuned to, is that sometimes the wheels of justice grind slow, but they grind exceeding small. And that level of proof required in court, that level of sophistication required in evidence gathering, to an observer often looks as if inspectors or the fiscal or the officers of either of those two bodies are dragging their feet. We learn to our cost how difficult sometimes it is in court to get a case through to the level of proof that we want. So we have to be very, very careful indeed that we put the right level of proof in front of a court to give ourselves the best possible chance of a conviction.
Finally, just in prosecutions, would you accept then that perhaps because of the Stockline situation, the effort that's been made in the Crown Office, the fact that we have a higher, a slightly higher percentage of inspectors than you might expect versus the rest of the UK, that we should have a higher level of prosecution? That would flow. What would stop that?
There is a logic implicit in the question, which is that if we're going to higher risk sectors, if we're looking at poorer performers, and we are looking for examples of where they're failing to manage and control risk, we would expect that to follow through in the level of enforcement we saw either in notices or in prosecutions, yes.
When you think you might be able to give us that in writing afterwards?
I'll give you some data on
Thank
that,
you.
yes.
Am I right in thinking that construction and agriculture are the two most dangerous trades?
Two of the three most dangerous.
The
third one is waste and recycling, that's right.
Can you tell me how many inspections there'll be in Scotland this year and next year in construction and agriculture? Can
we come back to you with that data? We can give you that data in detail. I know last year, the overall figure last year for inspections in Scotland, there are 73,000 premises in Scotland where HSE is the enforcing authority for health and safety legislation. And in 2011-12, we undertook 3,700 inspections in Scotland. I haven't broken that down into agriculture and construction because I haven't got the data. But what I would like to do, though, is emphasise that we have two very different intervention approaches in those two sectors. Would you like me to explain a little bit about those?
Well, I suppose the question I'd have is, are they reactive inspections where there's a complaint? That's proactive.
That's proactive inspections, yes.
Across the three? The
3,700 proactive inspections would be across the three and any other sectors that we were inspecting in, yes. And the reactive inspections would follow the reactive workload generated by the industrial landscape as a whole.
Sorry, so that 73, that's all proactive inspections in Scotland, but just that you would...
Sorry, which figure are you asking me to confirm?
Sorry, did you have a figure of 73?
I said we did 3,700 proactive inspections in Scotland, yes, in 2011-12.
Right. Out of the 73, okay.
Just one of the points, if I may, please. In agriculture, our interventions are not inspection-led. Now, what I mean by that is that experience has shown us that, unfortunately, the pattern of fatal and serious injury in agriculture is often age-related. That agricultural deaths tend to happen to very young farmers or to very old farmers. For reasons which we can hypothesize and we can surmise are to do with the pattern of how small holdings and holdings are actually passed through generations and so on. But one of the things that we've done for many years is actually say the most effective way of intervening with the farming community is not through face-to-face, one-to-one conversations. We've run things called safety and health awareness days in agriculture for many years now, and we run about 4 of these a year in Scotland, and we aim to get between 200 and 300 farmers along to each of these. They are what happens is a series of workplace scenarios are created for them by Lantra, so the industry, its own trainers, Lantra, set these things up. And we walk them through basic workplace hazard situations, and we say, if this is what you do, or this is what you should do when you go on a roof, this is what you should do when you're handling bales, this is what you should do when you're handling pesticides, etc. Now, that might sound a slightly less inspection-light approach, if you like, but the reality is that the feedback we get from those safety and health awareness days, and the most recent one we ran was in Stranraer last month, we get very positive feedback from that because farmers generally, like everybody else, are much more likely to listen to other farmers than they are to an inspector. And often farmers will actually listen to their wives more than anybody else either. So we have in the past, we have made efforts to try and influence farmers through reaching out to the women's institutes, things like that. Agriculture presents us with a unique set of problems. They're what we would euphemistically call a hard-to-reach group. So we have to come up with interesting to solve ways of dealing with their particular problems.
That's interesting and it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I suppose construction is quite different. I mean, obviously there's a high level of seasonal workforce within agriculture, but there is some stability around the business, you would hope. But in construction, you're essentially bringing a workplace together, you know, in a completely different way every single time you want to build something.
The unique characteristic of construction is that every construction worker has a unique opportunity on a daily basis to adapt their workplace. And in construction, again, you know, we don't say there's the construction landscape, let's hit everybody, or let's visit everybody. What we do in construction is we say that on the very small sites, and generally that's less than 15 people, fewer than 15 people, and in particular areas of construction, primarily refurbishment, where our statistics and our intelligence tells us people are more likely to have serious accidents, that's where we will focus our efforts. And we'll often do it we'll actually, I was going to say blitz, but that's not the right word. We will go to a particular area for a sustained period of time, and we will look at all the refurbishment jobs in that area, because we don't want just to visit and then walk away. We want to visit and create some kind of momentum and some gearing. We'll often get that. Our intelligence also suggests that some of the bigger jobs are generally the better run, but in situations unique to large projects. And one would be, for example, we are already having conversations with major contractors about the Commonwealth Games in 2014, looking to see what major construction work is likely to take place there. This far out, we are starting to talk with the main contractors to try and avoid having to visit them later in the process, that are actually getting their safety management plans together, so we won't have to visit them. So it's if you regard a sector as a complete entity, the way in which we sort of slice it up and intervene depends very much on the problems that we perceive need dealing with at the time, and that's why we've got different approaches in those different sectors.
That makes sense. You mentioned there that particularly in construction, that each worker on a construction site has got the opportunity to make that workplace safer. In other parts of Europe where we have a partnership model in the workplace more generally, we have much more of a culture of safety representatives, of people voluntarily. We have, I think there's a system in Sweden where people can serve notices on their own employer saying this is concerning, the legislation says that's wrong. You know, I'm going to inform you of it in a formal way. You've now got the opportunity to fix that for yourself, and we don't need to involve inspectors or a regulatory agency, and unless you're not able to come to it. Is there an opportunity in the declining numbers of inspectors, declining resources, in this area of work to look at those kind of partnerships to do more? Because the HSE has traditionally been quite hostile to that. They haven't necessarily saw trade unions as fulfilling that function.
I think actually we see trade unions as having a vital role in relation to workplace representation. Unfortunately, we visit a lot of workplaces nowadays with no trade union representation at all. So, we talk about employee involvement. That's the key for us, whether that be through the trade unions or some other worker representation. You're absolutely right. I think we had, when I was head of construction up here some years ago, we had a trial of workplace safety advisors, if you recall, which were advisors selected from the workplace who were actually visiting construction sites. And I think that had kind of a varied success. It seems to me what's key is worker involvement, because if they don't understand the risks, they will, I think, particularly in construction, they will tend to see risks in a different way to what you and I would see them as. And so when you talk to a construction worker about taking a risk, they often think that it's the risk of being caught rather than the risk of falling, for example. Again, going back to David's point about this whole risk recognition. So I think what we do, and the bigger sites are much better at this, they do have much more worker involvement. And there is no doubt that sites, and not just construction, but throughout various other sectors, and indeed in the public sector, where the workforce is involved in risk identification and control of risk, we get a much better solution.
Thank you.
Thanks. Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Convener. I want to take it back to the issues around asbestos and also local authorities. Ms Waldron, you mentioned that you had received a reassurance from local authorities. Can I ask, is that a reassurance that all authorities have a register in place, or is it a reassurance that they know where the asbestos in their area is, because the two are not the same? Knowing where the asbestos is doesn't mean that you have a formalised register. So can I ask what that reassurance from local authorities in Scotland relates to?
Do you know, I would, to be absolutely sure I'm giving you the right answer, I'd rather come back to you in writing on that and just see what questions we asked. My understanding is that those two go together. Unless they assume that there is asbestos in the building, they have to have a register to show where the asbestos is. I mean, in the more modern buildings, we know that asbestos will not have been used. So we're clearly talking about a particular age of building, but actually some of the more modern ones, surprisingly, up until 1990s. So I think, to be absolutely sure I'm giving you the right answer, I'd rather give you that in writing. I'm fairly comfortable it will be both things, that they know where the asbestos is, and if these are buildings that contain asbestos, that they have a register, and that register should actually be on site.
Okay. In relation to that then, when the duty to manage was introduced, was there an expectation of timescale for which registers were supposed to be compiled? I mean, obviously, I realise for the larger authorities it will be a difficult task because there is such a huge area to cover. But was there an anticipated timescale for all local authorities to have a register in place?
Well, we do allow people time to put new legislation in place, but I think it was actually done very swiftly. So, I mean, we will be talking now, these things will have been in place for some years.
I can't remember what year they were.
June will remember when the asbestos regulation. Yeah, I was thinking about 2004 when the duty to manage regulations came in. So, I think we would have accepted an action plan to do that at the time. But when we're in 2012, we would expect it to be done, and we would take enforcement action if it wasn't.
Yes.
So there would be penalties applicable to local authorities which by now did not have a compliant register of asbestos.
It would be unreasonable for a local authority to say in 2012, we haven't got a duty to manage asbestos register.
Okay. The convener spoke about the difficult balancing act that there often is around public perception. I have to be honest and say that at times it's also fuelled by politicians. I mean, having come from a council background, I can think of one discussion around a school which contained asbestos, where we were looking to co-locate pupils, and one councillor spoke of the fact that asbestos was there. It was effectively a death trap, which I didn't think was very helpful language. What efforts are you making to educate not just the population, but also politicians who obviously, we get our comments get picked up by the papers, and therefore there's a duty on us to be responsible in how we talk about health and safety issues, looking at it more widely as well. You mentioned some of the nonsensical health and safety stories that are out there. Often these are fueled by politicians repeating myths which a cursory check of the internet would demonstrate to be completely untrue. So what efforts are you making to try and ensure that that education is there, so that we don't have politicians standing up and talking about health and safety gone mad when it's clearly not true?
Well, this is a fine opportunity, because we've got a room now of people who I hope, if you don't agree with everything Pam and I have said, you're at least persuaded of a different approach to dealing with health and safety next time it maybe lands on your desk. I think we're fighting a tough battle on this, because the popular press likes to kick somebody, and it's been at health and safety for quite some time. I think we have two approaches to it. One is that I think you measure the impact of your regulatory activities by the wrongs that you put right, and by the people who actually think you've done the right thing on their behalf, because in a civilised society, people should not go to work and be injured, harmed or made ill. And if they come home in that state, we should be taking steps to make sure that's put right. So there's an element of, securing, a proper regulatory outcome in the form of justice that people recognise exists. I think, the extent to which we engage with, legitimise or otherwise show support for some of the more nonsense stories. There are two things that have been done in the last year which are relevant to that. One is we've got a Mythbusters panel, which sounds exactly what it is. If people think there is a silly piece of health and safety nonsense, they can take this to the Mythbusters panel. There's a very quick link on the HSE website, and the Mythbusters panel will then say, well, that does make sense, it doesn't make sense. The difficulty is that some of these health and safety stories are dressed up in the guise of something else, and for many years we've suspected and often proved that actually health and safety is used as a convenient and often lazy excuse for something else. There's another way that if people feel disgruntled about health and safety regulatory decisions, either by local authorities or by HSE, they can go to our regulatory challenge panel. Now, I'll give you a flavour that the Mythbusters panel has had in the tens of approaches. As far as I'm aware, the regulatory panel has had none so far. Most regulatory decisions, I think, are made properly. I say that involving HSE and local authority inspectors. Unfortunately, many of those myths pervade, and the classic ones like the Conkers. The Conkers comes around every year at horse chestnut time. The Christmas tree lights comes around every year now. There'll be something about salt on the roads at some point, or grit, about not putting grit outside your house when we get the first heavy snowfall. I think we've got fairly broad backs about that, but it is extremely frustrating. And if there is anything you would like to do to help us to try and sort of prick some of those nonsense bubbles, that would be magnificent.
Because I think it does detract from the things that do injure and make people ill at work, and that's the key thing, really. Unfortunately, the press are not so interested in the traditional things that we do, and what happens to people. They are more interested in these silly stories, because the sillier, the funnier, the more papers it seems to sell.
Okay. Just to cover the issue around local authorities, I was pleased to hear you reply to my colleague Bob Doris that you anticipate that you'll be able to maintain the number of frontline inspectors in Scotland. But obviously there are also budgetary pressures at a local authority level. And I wonder what direct consultation local authorities have with yourself when they come to design their budget for either the coming year, or if they're developing 3 or 5 year plans, specifically in relation to how they anticipate their budget for health and safety and their staffing within health and safety being affected by that. Because obviously that, if they are making decisions at their end, obviously there is a potential disconnect there if they're not speaking to yourselves. So are you confident that local authorities are consulting with yourselves when it comes to their budget setting process around their health and safety areas?
I would say that no, we don't do it at that level. We have a central local authority unit which has discussions at high level about the priorities for local authorities, but it's very much one for them to ensure that they are adequately resourced to deal with their duties under the Health and Safety at Work Act as enforcing authorities. So we don't have detailed local discussions about local authority budgets in relation to their health and safety enforcement.
There's something else I'd add to that, if I could, which is that I think as a regulator you're faced with a potentially vast agenda. And one of the hardest sets of regulatory decisions to make, and I hope I've given you a flavour of that in the last hour or so, is that you've actually got to be quite brutal about where you think you're going to make the biggest impact. You've got to be very brutal about what sectors you go to, what activities you're going to focus on, and the extent to which you are doing those at the obvious and transparent expense of other work. I think over the years we've learned to our cost that not doing that is much more dangerous than doing it badly. And so we have to make those tough decisions. And it's why that I'm cautious about using phrases which suggest that there might be whole swathes of manufacturing or other activity that are out of inspection scope. That's not the case. But those decision lines are drawn in positions which, for this next 12 months, for example, will push us towards a certain pattern and shape of premises and activities that might not be the same the year after. And I think that sort of discipline is necessary whether you're regulating in either the HSE or the local authority context. Thank you.
Just following on that theme, I'd like to explore some of the relationships. I think we need to get a marker for some, if there's any such session in the future. And obviously, there are many issues here that I would like to think that have been discussed with the Scottish Government because they'll have an impact on Scottish local authorities, the cut that you're experiencing, and in terms of the website that I read some time ago, that while there is a reserved area, there are good relationships with the Scottish Government. There have been staff exchanges that have taken place. There are meetings with ministers that have taken place, and I just want to explore, how you understand that relationship and what areas are discussed and covered.
Well, I think, first of all, it's an essential relationship because, as right at the very beginning, I said that there are some unique circumstances that arise from the Scottish context that we ignore at our peril. I think one of the interesting areas for us, and I invite Pam to add to it, is the overlap in the various healthcare-related areas, the extent to which, for example, we are involved in inspecting the NHS, the extent to which there are various issues that arise in the NHS which might be characterised as health and safety rather than care issues. I think we've got a very strong partnership through FAST, the Partnership on Health and Safety in Scotland, and we've got very strong links with STUC. I think, my own impression is that given the potential size of Scotland, we have a very heavy level of partnership in Scotland compared to equivalent areas south of the border. And I would answer it in two ways there, Convener. One would be to say, long may that continue, and may it continue to the benefit of working people in Scotland. But also, are there any specific points you would like to throw back at us that you would like us to consider in more detail?
I was looking at, I don't know when the last time there has been an engagement, whether that engagement takes place between officials and yourselves, whether it takes between yourself and ministers, when the last ministerial engagement took place. Have we discussed the impact in Scotland of the 35% cut in your budget, and what risks are? Does that present to how we manage risk in Scotland? The most recent legislation, I think there was a direction to the HSC to divert all local authority health and safety inspection to yourselves. Was that Lofsted's?
Lofsted review, and that's still work in progress, Convener.
So what discussion and progress are taking place in these issues with the Scottish Government?
Routine briefings through officials is how we deal with it in the main, and we do get contacted directly from by MSPs and also MPs in Scotland. But generally, on a routine basis, it is discussions through officials, and we do try and make sure that we provide routine briefings on anything which you would want to, Scottish Government would want to be alerted on. So, for example, we have had some discussions about Legionnaire's disease outbreak, quite a lot of correspondence about that.
Yeah, but there's been no discussion like we've had this morning that there's a 35% cut. You've got new legislation in place which will affect the Scottish context. And the relationship between, I think that there is some general concern that the relationship between the reliance on local authority and responsibility of inspection and duties that they have that complement yours, they're experiencing a cut, you're experiencing a 35% cut. What will this mean? And the idea that you haven't reassured the Scottish Government in this context is, if not concerning, it's surprising.
The local authority discussions go on directly with the local authorities on a regular basis.
And yourselves? Through
COSLA, but also directly through the partnership arrangements we have with the local authorities through the senior officer groups. But we also, the code you're talking about, which came out of the Lufstead review, that is currently being developed and doesn't come into play until April next year. So there will be discussions about that, that will be in the same way as we're discussing it with local authorities south of the border.
Okay. The other areas that were alluded to by Dr. Snowball were the protocol in regards that is in place between the care inspectorate and yourself, and how you see that going, and the health improvement centre, the health improvement service. There's a letter of understanding apparently in that area as well. Can you say something about that?
One thing to say at the outset is that the regulatory landscape is quite complicated.
Seems so.
Well, I'm probably putting it mildly, convener. It's very complicated. I think we seem to invest a huge amount of effort in. It's interesting. We talk about memoranda of understanding, and generally the situations where the memoranda have to be applied, pass all understanding. Really, that we have to make some quite animated conversations with colleagues and other regulatory bodies about the extent to which something is or isn't a health and safety issue. But it actually goes back to something we talked about earlier on. To do with the context in which health and safety at work is often appropriated for health and safety at anywhere else but work contexts, and the conversations or the conversations that we have with people like the care inspector, if I sort of call it that for simplicity, are often to do with areas where we don't think health and safety at work legislation should be applied, and care of patients and so on is the appropriate mechanism. But I think I would want to leave you in no doubt that we must maintain and foster those relationships for the well-being of all of us and in terms of our regulatory activity. Otherwise, we could easily be blown off course in all sorts of areas where we've got multiple regulators who are all competing for that regulatory space.
So this is an attempt. The protocols and the letters of understanding are first steps in trying to do that.
That's right.
And do we have encouragement from the Scottish Government that should happen?
I don't.
Yes.
Yes.
Very much so.
Yes.
Yes, and I think it is very. There will always be grey areas in any kind of overlapping legislation, and sometimes these just have to be dealt with on a case by case basis. But I think we are clearer than we've ever been before in terms of who takes the lead in a particular area. We also published quite extensive guidance, fairly recently updated, on the extent to which health and safety issues, as opposed to care issues, would be HSE's lead, rather than with the care industry, with the care regulator. Sorry.
So that's an ongoing process in all settings, not just in residential care, but in the community. Because
absolutely.
I think we know from our casework that the health and safety is used, in some cases, becomes a bit of an obstruction to providing care in someone's home, for instance.
We can't become the regulator of last resort. It's right that we define what it is that what responsibilities we have, and what responsibility, how that interfaces with the responsibilities of others. And I think we have got much better at that over recent years. And the memorandum of understanding I signed in the summer with the new care inspectorate, I think, was far clearer in relation to our respective responsibilities than it's been in the past.
Just want to get these on the record. In terms of this is my last one, the Asbestos Liaison Group. Does this help to inform the Scottish Government here about impacts on the health budget with people presenting for asbestos? Is any of that type of discussion going on?
I don't know, sir. I don't know whether there have been those direct discussions, but we could certainly find out and let you know if that is the case.
Mm-hmm. But the Asbestos Liaison Group, it meets. Is there
we're looking puzzled on that.
We are looking.
It's every 4 months or every 3 months.
Right. Yeah, we'll give you the detail on that.
Yeah, it would be interesting.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. Bob Doris.
Thanks, Convener. I said I'd want to come back in maybe for a couple of questions. The first one, briefly. I'm minded that a former MSP was seeking, Dr Bill Wilson had been seeking to look at a system of equity fines. If the expression is wrong, I apologise to the committee, but effectively it was the concern that when you fine a company in relation to a breach of health and safety, that fine has to be commensurate with their ability potentially to continue to trade, because it could actually penalise the very workers that were at risk. And I think it was the ICL Stockline experience that prompted Dr Wilson to shine a light on that. And just I was thinking about that when I was listening to the evidence. I was wondering whether or not, given the fact that you now need to use fines via the FIFA process in the next 3 years, and it would be up to £50 million in 3 years, if there's a concern that you have to balance the fines for breaches with the ability for certain companies to trade. I mean, I assume health and safety is absolute. If there's a risk in enforcement and they don't comply, they are closed down. That's absolute. But in terms of having proportionate fines, can you tell me your thoughts about that? Because the very workers at risk could be affected by being disproportionate.
Yes, it's not a fine. It is recovering the costs for regulating where there is a material breach. That is the issue. So it's not based on an ability to pay, which in some cases, of course, a fine might be. The important thing here is that where there is a failure to comply with the law, and that failure is, in the inspector's opinion, so significant that it requires some written notification by way of letter or enforcement notice or prosecution, then HSE is required to recover its costs. And it will recover the costs from for the visit and indeed for any associated follow-up work, including letter writing or whatever.
Thank you, and I apologise for the terminology. I was just thinking about the principle of the money going from the company for the costs that you've incurred, and that seems eminently reasonable, but will there be consideration? Because 50 million is not an insignificant sum. Can you give me an idea of what that could mean for an individual company? You must have done some modelling work in relation to this.
We have, and in terms of the money we expect to get back on cost recovery, that is really based on the number of inspections we typically do in a year, and the number of places we go to where we find a material breach. So, we're not driven by cost recovery. We operate in the same way that we always have, although we are improving our targeting and intelligence so that we go to the places, as David said, that we need to go, that need our interventions, those places which are higher risk, those places where they perform more poorly than the rest of the industry. So we go to the right places, and the indication is that at about 60% of the places we go to, we are likely to find a material breach. Now, that is just a rough guesstimate in terms of, financial planning. When we're there, we are also very conscious of the fact we need to operate as efficiently as possible, so that we are not incurring costs unnecessarily for the company. And we are acutely aware of that. It is very early days for us in cost recovery. I think in the next 6 months' time we will be doing a review, and there'll be a bigger review after 12 months to look at the impact of cost recovery on both ourselves as a regulator and, of course, on industry.
I think the committee would very much appreciate to get an idea of what kind of costs are recovered from which type of industries and which type of firms. My second question I wanted to ask was, actually surprised none of us have asked it until now, the consolidation of health and safety regulations, and that's quite a meaty target for a reduction of 50% by 2015. Well, rather than make a judgment, I could be the irresponsible politician and say this is outrageous, it means we're going to have an unsafe workplace, but to get a flavour of what it may actually mean, could you give me an example? You must already be looking at an example of where you can consolidate legislation. So could you give me an example for the committee for where maybe 2 or 3 pieces of health and safety regulations could be consolidated into the one more efficient piece to make it more meaningful for us? Or else we would go down the road of saying less regulation, that might not necessarily be a good thing. It's about effective regulation rather than the amount of regulations there.
That's absolutely right. Just to contextualise it as well, the Health and Safety at Work Act, which, as I said at the beginning, is the kind of the foundation building stone of all health and safety legislation in Great Britain. Section 1 of the Health and Safety at Work Act says you can't replace anything covered by the Act with a lower standard. So you've got that sort of initial trigger, really. What I will do after it, we will write to you and confirm the number of pieces of legislation in the mines and the explosives sector where we have got significant numbers of individual pieces of legislation which are being policy colleagues are now working on ways of bringing that together into a better package. And I think that there's 2 reasons for doing that. One of which is that over time pre-1974, when the Health and Safety at Work Act came in, there was a tendency for rule makers to write legislation to stop the last accident. Very prescriptive legislation that said, we've had an accident, we've learned lessons, let's stop that by making sure that never happens again. And of course, that implies perfect forethought in order to cover every possible eventuality. And prescriptive legislation that says you cannot do inevitably means to prescriptive legislation that says, and you can't do B, C, D, E, F, etc., either. So the goal-setting legislative framework in the UK, built on the back of the Health and Safety at Work Act, is that where possible we should say those are the standards to which industry should aspire. And where we've got prescriptive legislation, you're tempted to sort of go up to the kind of the stop point and say, well, we've got that far and no need to go further. Goal-setting legislation helps you break through that. And many of the pieces of legislation that will fall into those 2 sectors, which we'll provide further detail on, I think you will see from the titles that actually gives, I hope, reassures you that legislation isn't being screwed up in a ball and thrown in the wastebasket.
There's maybe an opportunity for regulation to improve through this process. I'd also be keen to know when you update the committee. I think there's a lot of scribbling going on furiously in the background there. I think there's going to be a lot of updating of the committee following this session, but I'd be interested to know what discussions you have with trade unions and other workers' representatives in relation to that, because it's fundamental to get trade unions to buy in to the principle of better regulation. And
we would be failing in our responsibility as a regulator if we didn't negotiate regulatory changes properly with trade unions. Okay.
Drew Smith, followed by Richard Simpson.
Thank you, Convener. There was maybe 2 or 3 things that I wanted to raise, but one is maybe quite specific. But could I just quickly ask about the position in relation to silica dust in Scotland? And there's some suggestion that there's an increase in silicosis. Could you maybe just give us a flavour of your involvement in that and how extensive do you think that problem is?
I haven't any specific information, but I assume we're talking about the construction industry. Again, that's something we're going to have to let you have some specific information on, if that's okay.
Yep, no, it's quite specific.
There have been the usual initiatives that have taken place in relation to control of dust, but I'm sure we could give you a much better reply in writing.
Sure, that's great. In relation to, I suppose it goes back to the point that the convener was raising around scrutiny and kind of following the different parts of this. A question I would have, I would certainly have the impression that there'll be a desire amongst local authorities is subject to the cost pressures that you are, and of course they are, and every other part of government is, to pull back from their role in health and safety, and there's an impression that may be going on. What is your role in terms of stopping that from happening and encouraging local authorities to remain in that area, working to extend it and to make sure that it's appropriate to their area? And I suppose, given the possibility of further cuts to yourselves in the future, how do we whistleblow for inspectors? How do inspectors, either at environmental health level within local authorities or HSE inspectors themselves, hold their hands up and say, actually, we used to have 2 inspectors in quarries and now we've got 1, and I'm struggling to do the work here, or whatever the example is?
I think the key question to any regulator is demonstrate to an appropriate level of proof that you understand the context in which you operate, you've made sensible priorities at what you can do based on the resources you've got, and those resources are applied to those areas that most need your regulatory activity. Now, unfortunately, that might mean you can't do everything you would like to do, but you're certainly focused on the things that you must do. And if I boil it down to 3 things, I mean, for me, it is as simple as this in terms of regulatory integrity and regulatory purpose. Whether you're HSE or whether you're a local authority, if you're in a position of responsibility and authority in any of those regulatory bodies, you've got to be able to answer 3 questions. Are you going to the right places? Are you doing the right things? Are you finishing what you start? Because if you don't answer in the affirmative and in a sensible way to those questions, actually, the obvious follow-up question is, well, what is your regulatory strategy? What is it you're trying to do? What is it you're trying to achieve? Evaluations are terribly difficult in health and safety because you can't prove to any level of reasonable understanding the extent to which you think you've stopped people being injured or hurt. But you can use proxies for that. You can say that because we got 250 farmers together at a Safety and Health Awareness Day, we showed them what good practice looked like, and we didn't do it with a big regulatory stick. Because we did an intense campaign of refurbishment inspections in the construction industry in Dundee in a couple of weeks in February, whenever it happened to be, we drew attention to the fact that those were unsafe, unsatisfactory practices. So I think if that's, I would approach the question in that way. And the answer to your question, how do you whistleblow? The answer to that, I think, would be, to what extent are you persuaded or otherwise that regulators have got a programme that makes sense to a lay observer?
Can I add to that, that in terms of the specific local authorities, we have regular discussions. We have a partnership team that actually covers both Scotland and Northern England, who have regular quarterly meetings with their local authority counterparts to discuss issues like the types of premises they're visiting, how they are managing to ensure that the higher risk profile industries are the ones, or sectors are the ones that they are concentrating their resource on. So I'd say it's a very healthy dialogue, two-way dialogue between ourselves and our local authority counterparts.
I suppose in that there seems to be quite a useful role in that sort of setting for you to use your expertise and to share what's going on around the country to say maybe this sort of inspection is not the best way to get to that problem. But is that also the forum where you say, actually, you've just pulled back from a whole range of responsibilities that you used to exercise, and for budget reasons you're not? Because in terms of, from our point of view here, the involvement in the Scottish Government in this, the people that set these local authority budgets, there needs to be an awareness of what is the level of regulation and inspection and all these other bits of it, appropriate? Or are people taking the opportunity to say health and safety is an easy cut?
I think what we are seeing is that there are pressures just as there are with HSE, but they do have a regulatory responsibility under the Health and Safety at Work Act, and so to that extent it is more about, yes, they understand it continues to be resourced, it has to be. We are assisting local authorities and have done for a number of years on the framework that they need in order to deliver the responsibilities to enforce health and safety legislation. I think it works well. We do provide a lot of support to local authorities in terms of our specialist expertise that's provided by HSE, and also we provide training in particular areas. So, for example, the LPG programme that we talked about earlier today, we were able to take the same approach. Both local authorities and HSE took the same approach to the premises they were responsible for, with a joint training package, in the same way as we will be taking a joint approach to the lead Legionella work, which we have just commenced in the west of Scotland, where we will be working jointly with our local authority colleagues, inspecting premises with cooling towers in the west of Scotland. So it is very much working together, and we have not had an issue where a local authority has said, we don't want to work with you, we don't have the resource to do that.
If I can, I know in Scotland the executive, the previous Scottish executive had funded a Scottish Health and Safety Action Plan, I think at some point, and I was slightly surprised by what you were saying around that there hadn't been direct ministerial engagement with the executive via local government, and so the public health minister, I think, is the health and safety lead in the Scottish government. And I know that in the STEC's written evidence to the Scottish Affairs Committee, they said that they felt that there was a role for this Parliament to provide some more scrutiny around this, and whether that would be through the laying of reports as appropriate. Possibly not in a formal way, because obviously the legislative function is clearly reserved, but there are issues where we've got responsibilities that can assist you in terms of enforcement. I suppose my question is simply, does that cause any difficulties for you? Is that something that you've relaxed about? We've obviously got the opportunity of the session here today. I wouldn't be necessarily asking for I suppose it would be regular in parliamentary terms over the course of a parliamentary term. Should we be looking to examine the devolved aspects of these questions?
I think in terms of the phrase that you used in terms of parliamentary scrutiny, I think one thing we would be very keen to be is open and honest with you. What we want you to see, hopefully, is that we are responsible regulators, and whilst it's not a devolved function, very as you know, it is something that is so clearly linked with the your interests, and plus the work of the Scottish Government, that we would want to retain as much transparency as possible. Obviously, hence taking up the invitation to come today. I'm not quite sure what you meant by the phrase of parliamentary scrutiny, but I guess we're always happy to be scrutinised, and and we would hope to be able to give sensible answers to the questions, and if we can't answer the questions immediately, to come back with the facts and figures that you need.
Thank you. Richard Simpson, I think that's our last question.
A couple of questions, if I may, Convener. The context that we are all in is one of austerity at the present time, and one of the things that tends to happen in periods of contraction in funding is that maintenance budgets are significantly affected. Now, this committee has already had some discussions in relation to the current budget about the Audit Scotland report, which showed a doubling of the maintenance backlog in the health service in Scotland from 500 million back in the last Parliament to $1 billion now. And although we received reassurances that almost half of that, or even more than half, was not urgent repairs, there was still £400 million of outstanding backlog of repairs. Now, in terms of your function in relation to the health service, for me that's a worry as a politician, but also as a doctor, that this is happening. But have you had any further discussions about how the health service is prioritising its backlog in relation to health and safety issues?
We had a recent meeting with the best route in. It's this issue about how do we get best coverage quickly. Our best route in is the facilities managers group. Yes. And I know that one of my colleagues has had recent discussions with them about the issues. In fact, HSE has taken enforcement in relation to a number of maintenance issues over the last 12 months. We had a discussion as to why that was, and whether in fact there was any particular targeting of the NHS in Scotland, and the answer was no, there was no particular targeting, but there were clearly issues that need to be addressed. So we have laid it very clearly out to that group that there is a crying need for priorities in relation to health and safety issues, and I think they are entirely in agreement with that. So that was our last discussion about it.
That's helpful. The other group that has been reporting has been the Ombudsman, Public Services Ombudsman, saying that the complaints that he receives over the years haven't changed very much. There hasn't been a lot of action. Now, I don't see many of them being in relation to health and safety, but I wonder if you've had any conversations with the Public Services Ombudsman. No. Okay, and I've just, to finish with, Convener, two very specific issues. One is that I've been pressing for the removal and replacement of swan neck taps, because these seem to be associated with an increased risk of Legionella, but of other infections. And I've been assured that, well, there was a program that when refurbishment was occurring, they would be replaced, but there's no active program. And I'm not looking for an immediate answer, but perhaps if you could provide me with any information on that, as well as perhaps a link to the enforcement actions that in the health service in the last year. If you have a link to a website for that, if you could provide us with that.
Yes, the HSE website, and if you go to press notices, you can you can scroll through all the prosecutions in Scotland in the last 12 months and the COPs.
The prosecution database.
Yes, but we'll provide that information for you.
That's very good of you. And the last thing is that we've had a motion tabled in the Parliament on the 10th of December by Alison Johnson, the Green member, referring to a research led by Professor Andrew Watterson at the University of Stirling, which says that there is strong evidence that women employed in the plastics industry are exposed to workplace chemicals that can raise their risk of breast cancer and reproductive abnormalities. And the motion goes on to express concern that the UK government is directing the Health and Safety Executive away from active inspection of sectors such as plastics to concentrate on reactive visits. Now, before I sign up to this, I would like to have your comment as to whether this element about the UK government is correct, but also any comment you've got on the Watterson report.
Okay, I'll take those in sequence then. When I talked earlier about devoting your efforts to the priority sectors, I deliberately didn't say low risk, high risk. I said lower and higher. So no sector is ever taken out of the inspection menu, if you like. At the minute, it is true that our inspection decisions and the decisions of where we will go mean that the standard industrial classification that covers plastics falls on the other side of the line. So that's a management decision HSE has taken in order not to exceed the total number of inspections that we've been told that we should be doing. We've got to cut that coat according to the cloth. Sorry, the specific question about the Watterson report.
Just to say that I don't know if you're aware of this report and whether that would actually...
The Regulating Scotland report.
I don't know if it's Scotland or not, but he happens to be at the University of Stirling, and whether it's a UK-wide report or a Scottish one is not clear here.
Right.
And I haven't read the report yet, but it did occur to me that this might lead to your reviewing the plastics element of your
I'm aware of the specific report about cancers, and as I hope we've both tried to convey over the course of the session is that whilst on the one hand it's important that you are convinced and that everybody is convinced that we make decisions that are sensible and proportionate, occasionally events come along which cause us to reevaluate whether those decisions were actually right. So that would be the sort of context in which I would answer that question.
Can I thank you both on behalf of the committee for your time and the evidence provided this morning. Thank you very much indeed. I suspend the session at this point. We're going into private session as we previously agreed.